Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. There's no good news today. There's just not. Maybe there will be later in the day, but not right now. We have, I don't know if these are all bad or all crazy or all really bad and really crazy. Jim, this is just not good here on Thursday. Let's start with the first one. I'm going to call it bad. Yesterday, this was also our bad martini, and that was Trump's what appears to be sudden decision to withdraw about 2,000 U.S. forces from Syria without apparently a lot of consultation, which ought to be concerning. Apparently, Secretary Mattis, who we love, argued quite strongly against this move. But anyway, yesterday, Trump tweeted at about 9:30 in the morning, "We have defeated ISIS in Syria. My only reason for being there during the Trump presidency." Then he released a video standing out in the Rose Garden and had to say this about why it was time to bring them home as well.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
And so, once again, declaring victory. Well, a lot of people on Capitol Hill, a lot of people in the national security realm say that's just not the case, although the Trump administration has done a great job, largely through loosening the rules of engagement, of beating back ISIS, and there's been a tremendous amount of progress, but they're not dead yet. And then today, Trump tweets out at about 7:16 this morning, Russia, Iran, Syria, and many others are not happy about the U.S. leaving, despite what the fake news says, because now they will have to fight ISIS and others who they hate without us. I am building by far the most powerful military in the world. ISIS hits us. They are doomed. Jim, how can Russia, Iran, and Syria fight ISIS if they're already defeated?
I was going to say, I pointed out that glaring contradiction in today's Morning Jolt. And look, I remember having an argument with a former colleague during the 2016 campaign where we were discussing Trump being kind of warm and fuzzy towards Vladimir Putin, that he certainly did not seem to have the skepticism and suspicion and wariness that history would require when dealing with Putin and the Russian state as a whole. And my former colleague is a very knowledgeable guy. He spent time in Russia. But he said, we're going to have an alliance with Russia, and Russia is going to help us defeat ISIS and Islamists. That has not come to pass. And what's more, you talk to people in the intelligence community, and this is not, secret sources. They openly discuss this pretty much going back to 9/11. Every single time the United States intelligence community met with its counterparts in Russia, because Russia said, hey, we want to help you fight ISIS. We want to help you fight Islamists and Al-Qaeda and groups like that. We've had these problems with the Chechens. We understand. The conversations almost always begin, so who are your secret sources in the Islamist ranks? Tell us what you know. Tell us everything you've got and all your good stuff. And after that, we'll tell you all of our good stuff. And obviously, this is not the first time rival intelligence agencies have tried to cooperate. There's always an element of, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. But they basically found the Russians very difficult to deal with. They basically concluded that all of these outreach efforts on the part of the Russian government, generally the information they got was not enormously useful. Generally, the Russians were very interested in getting basically information sharing in a one-way direction. They wanted the Americans to give up their good stuff and to give them stuff that was not all that useful in the past. You may remember the Russians kind of gloating after the Boston Marathon bombing of, we warned you about those guys. Well, yeah, but, you didn't give us anything particularly useful or pointing to these guys in particular and things like that. So Russian cooperation has not been that great. And I don't trust the Russians to outsource a group that could be a threat to the United States and our allies, both in Europe and in the Middle Eastern region. I just don't. I just don't think this is a job for them. Now, look, Greg, you and I talked about this yesterday. If Mattis says this is a good move, the conditions on the ground justify it, it's a very different conversation. I'm fine with that. It said something that the United Kingdom did not think this was a good idea. It means, because we all know how warlike the Brits are. Now, people might be scoffing considering their history, but, look at Theresa May and all the problems they have over there. The Brits don't want to stay in the Middle East any longer than anybody else does. You look at every possible defense expert, people in the administration, outside the administration, on Capitol Hill. None of them concur with this assessment that ISIS is defeated. They've had the snot kicked out of them. They are a shadow of their former self. They've been driven out of all of their land, almost all of their major territories. Look, everything Trump said in the first couple sentences was true and is worthy of being saluted and celebrated. But the last thing you want to do is leave some of these guys intact because we just went through this about 6 years ago. We already saw this when we, pulled out of Iraq. And then, of course, the Western Iraq fell very quickly to ISIS once they appeared on the scene. I don't want U.S. forces to get out of there until we're absolutely certain either there's nobody left to come back or that the people who we're leaving behind can repel the likes of ISIS or some, the next great Islamist group that comes along. So anyway, very frustrating. I mean, we've seen Trump make comments in this vein many times during his presidency, and generally Mattis and the others managed to talk him down. I don't know if this is going to happen in this case. And there's also some reports that a total withdrawal from Afghanistan may be coming down the pike as well. So very ominous, very troubling. I suppose it's still possible the president will change his mind, but so far he seems to be going further. And I don't know about you, Greg. It feels like the two – I have my suspicions that our two early bad martinis today are connected.
Yeah, they could be. And just to clarify, he says Russia, Iran, Syria, and many others are not happy about the U.S. leaving. Here's a smorgasbord on a quick Google search of Putin, Trump, Syria. New York Times, Putin welcomes Trump's Syria withdrawal. Donald's right. Al Jazeera, Syria, Putin welcomes Trump's decision to pull out U.S. troops. Washington Post, Putin backs Trump's move to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, and on it goes. So clearly, Putin's very upset about this. And Jim, one entity here that we haven't talked about and who's totally getting screwed again are the Kurds, we've hung out to dry before. We finally got them to trust us again. And now if this stays on course, it's deja vu all over again.
The other thing that is strange about this, Greg, look, I was a guy who I was not writing at NR then, but I was among those who believed back in 2003, well, Saddam Hussein's got WMDs, we better go in there. This guy's a threat. Generally was supportive of the Iraq war. And like many people, I've looked at and said, well, if nothing else, we certainly did not need to go to war based on what we know now in March 2003. Maybe you can make the argument that a clash between Saddam Hussein and the United States government was inevitable, or maybe Uday or Qusay would have taken over and Iraq would have turned into a different kind of threat. But it's okay to look back at our decisions in the Middle East and ask ourselves, did we do the right thing? Did we, were we too quick to use force and questions like that? I don't know how you look at recent experience and don't come to this conclusion. And the other thing is you look at, the 2006 election, you look at the 2008 election. By that time period, the American people were tired of the Iraq war. They were tired of seeing flag-draped coffins come home. They had concluded that the cost in blood and treasure was just too darn high, and they did not want to see it continue anymore. And there's a part of me that says once the American people reach a decision like that, you may have a need to accept that decision of the voters. Now, the great irony is that, between 2006 and 2008, the Anbar province, the uprising, the awakening, and all of a sudden, under General Petraeus, Iraq got a heck of a lot more stable. Of course, by 2008, the economy collapsed, and we had other political issues we were thinking about. But just think about it. The irony is you see this push to come out of Syria. We haven't had overwhelming casualties to our guys in Syria. In fact, I'd argue most days you don't even hear about U.S. forces being in Syria. And my understanding is that mostly what we're doing there, we are assisting local forces. We're trying to train local forces, but the aim is to have them do most of the work and not have lots of American men, being in the line of fire in these sorts of operations. So I don't see a clamoring public desire to get out of Syria. It's nowhere near as controversial and engaging with people the way it was in 2006, 2007, and the early part of 2008. So kind of strange to see this sudden shift and sudden emphasis on something, particularly when the entire defense and national security establishment is saying, no, this is not the right move.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical point because I do sympathize with the libertarian argument here to some extent because you're always going to have radicals in that part of the world who are looking to destabilize. And if you stick around until you take out the very last one, you're never going to leave. But you do have to rely on your best people and your best intelligence to make the decision that the threat is tamped down to the point where there's no realistic threat of it reemerging to the point anywhere close to where it was, at least. So very confusing, to say the least. All right, let's move to more Trump tweets. which are never good martinis, usually. This one's certainly not. This is now with the back and forth over demanding the $5 billion for the border wall. Last night, by unanimous consent, actually, the U.S. Senate agreed to a stopgap funding measure with no money for the wall that would fund the government till early February. Obviously, at that point, the Democrats would be controlling the House. They're taking up the debate on that in the House today. A lot of the Freedom Caucus folks planning to fight against it, but if there's enough Democrats to go with it, I don't see how the Freedom Caucus is going to stop it. But nonetheless, the president's tweeting about this. We all saw his on-camera debate with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi a few days ago, but this was this morning at 7:28. Trump, the Democrats, who know that steel slats, wall, are necessary for border security, are putting politics over country. What they are just beginning to realize is that I will not sign any of their legislation, including infrastructure, unless it has perfect border security. USA wins. 11 minutes later, with so much talk about the wall, people are losing sight of the great job being done on our southern border by Border Patrol, ICE, and our great military. Remember the caravans? Well, they didn't get through, and none are forming or on their way. Border is tight. Fake news silent. So at this point, we're not about to fund a wall, or at least part of it, on the southern border of our country, that is. Now, when it comes to Mexico's southern border, we're totally on board. LA Times, the United States on Tuesday announced it was adding billions of dollars to an ambitious Mexican development project for that country's southern region and Central America as a way to deter migration. But neither Washington nor Mexico City announced any headway in the Trump administration's goal of keeping Central American asylum seekers in Mexico and out of the United States. In simultaneous announcements in the U.S. and Mexican capitals, the U.S. State Department and Mexican Foreign Secretary Marcelo Ebrard said the United States has committed to $5.8 billion in public and private money for Central America and an additional $2 billion for southern Mexico. And it's obvious with the stopgap bill, Jim, that congressional Republicans aren't real excited about going to war over this wall as well, which is a lot different than what the House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy was saying just a month before the midterm elections. This was on Laura Ingram's show on Fox News.
Well, I don't think the question is if it will pass the House. The name of this bill is Build the Wall, Enforce the Law. So it fully funds the wall at $25 billion, but it even does more. You know, Kate's Law, which we passed, is a part of this. Stops sanctuary cities. It keeps children safe because it removes the MS-13 gang members. And it denounces this movement like in San Francisco that allows illegals to vote in our election. But I watched what McConnell just said today. He said we're going to have a vigorous fight over the wall in December. And watching what this Senate was able to do with Kavanaugh, I believe this gives them the opportunity and the time to get this done once and for all.
A lot of talk, Jim. Not a lot of action.
Nope. Lot to unpack there, Greg, starting with Trump beginning a tweet with so much talk about the wall. Gee, how did that happen, Mr. President? What got so many people talking about the wall all the time? And then he says, later in that tweet, he says, border is tight, fake news silent. Well, first of all, if they're silent, then it's not really fake news because they're not saying it. But yeah. So there's that. But border is tight. Well, if you say the border is tight, gee, that doesn't sound bad. That doesn't look pretty good. Which, by the way, you can make that argument, I think, for the first, let's say, 8-9 months of the Trump administration. People come across the border actually did go down pretty significantly. But then it gradually went up month by month, and we're back to where things were before Trump took over. But look, in that meeting with Schumer and Pelosi, let's have no illusions. He said, he was asked specifically, you say border security, the wall. Can you have border security without the wall? And the President Trump said explicitly, no, you need the wall. The wall is part of border security. All right. So to him, there was no level of border security without a wall that he considered sufficient. To him, they were synonyms. And to say that you could have, in fact, Schumer kept saying you can have a secure border without a wall, and Trump kept saying no, no, no. So when Trump starts coming out and saying, look, all this talk about the wall, the border is tight. This looks like a complete reversal on what he was saying a week ago. And yeah, we say Trump lies a lot, Trump flip-flops a lot, but this is a big one, right? This is the wall, right? This was a big part of what he was talking about and what he ran on in 2016. Now, the rest of his tweet talking about what a great job the Border Patrol is doing. Yes, indeed. No, God bless them. They're doing a great work. But if they're doing such, the question was that the great work they were doing was not sufficient, right? And you talk to them, they argue you don't need the equivalent of the Great Wall of China being built from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico They want a wall. They want a wall in certain patches, which basically kind of almost acts like a funnel, right? It basically, makes the people who are trying to cross illegally aim for certain places. You put more manpower in those certain places, and you can catch the people. So a secure, partially walled or partially bollarded fences. It's 18 feet tall, very tough to climb over. To me, I think that is a realistic goal and one that I think would be good for the country. The problem is Trump seems to think that the way he gets it is every couple of weeks he tweets, Congress must pass a bill to build the wall. That's not really how these things come together. Tweeting is not enough. I just went on a little bit of a Twitter diatribe about this before we started taping, Greg, that think back to how Obama passed Obamacare. And when people say, how can you point to Obamacare? No, the point is not that Obamacare is good, but just look at how they did it. Because I think everybody would agree Obamacare was big and consequential. Arguably the biggest and most consequential piece of legislation passed in the past decade, maybe even 2 decades. And it did not come easily to the Obama administration, right? They spent a better part of 18 months beating the drum for it. Obama campaigned on it. And then the work of getting it, putting it all together in the bill. The bill was 1,000 pages. Obama had originally campaigned against the individual mandate. Then he decided he was going to need it, embraced it. And then you get into, when you try to get something passed through Congress, you got a horse trade. You basically have, big changes don't happen unless you get a lot of people buying into it. And to get them to buy into it, sometimes you got to compromise. So you got to have a real good sense of what your priorities are. You got to really know the difference between the things you need to have in that legislation and the things that you just kind of want to have in that legislation. You got to know your coalition. You got to know who in your party is willing to vote for what. You may recall that the unions were not happy to see the Cadillac plans getting taxed under the Obamacare legislation. But Obama knew how to placate them and how to give them enough, throw enough crumbs their way to get them on board. Remember the Cornhusker kickback? I mean, these are things we think of being disgraceful. We thought they were bad, but $10 million for Michigan to get somebody online, or for Bernie Sanders online. They turn this bill joke as the legislation turns into a Christmas tree. Everybody comes and puts their ornament on. They have one idea or one little. Sometimes it's an earmark. Sometimes it's some provision that's really going to help their state or help their district, and they put it in there. And generally, this makes the legislation bigger and more complicated, and certainly not elegant and simple. But that's what it takes to get it passed. And you don't have to like this. This is not Jim saying this is all terrific. I'm saying this is how the system works, and this is how you get bills passed. Read LBJ. Read Master of the Senate. This didn't get invented yesterday. This is something the way it's always been when you wanted to make a big, complicated change to American laws. And Trump never wanted to do any of this. Trump did not have the attention span for this. He didn't want to get into the details. I remember during the first effort to repeal Obamacare, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, to the House Freedom Caucus, don't get hung up on the little stuff. But to the House Freedom Caucus, the little stuff was important. That was really, that was a priority to them. I remember the other time when, Steve Bannon, of all people, went to the House Freedom Caucus and began the meeting. Guys, you have no choice. You have to vote for this legislation. I don't know that they all gave a middle finger to Steve Bannon. I hope they did. But the answer was no, they don't have to. They're members of Congress. They're not slaves. They're not, automatons. You can try to persuade them, but if they don't want to vote for something, they're not going to vote for something. And the entire Trump White House has really not understood this on this stuff. The passing funding for the border wall was always going to be challenging. And for a week ago, Trump said he was going to shut down the government. Now, we're recording this a little bit after noon on Thursday. As of this point, House Republicans have canceled a press conference. They're heading over to the White House. Nobody knows exactly what the president is going to do, but it certainly sounds like, or at least as of this morning, he was going to sign whatever mini omnibus they were going to put on his desk. And maybe he's reversing that. So that's this is where we are. This is, my suspicion is that Trump does end up signing it. And I keep hearing from people, no, Trump's got a plan. Trump's got, it's going to happen. Look, do you think it gets easier to get funding for the wall when the Democrats control the House? I don't think so. But, I suppose that's, you're judging the game in the 8th inning. Well, was the plan to build 40 miles of bollard fencing in the first 2 years and then finish it the rest in the next 2 years? Was that the plan there? So reality is just crashing into the Trump administration really hard this week.
There's a lot of people comparing Trump, if he doesn't get anything on this, to George Bush 41's Read My Lips, No New Taxes pledge. They think it could do that much damage. Rush Limbaugh was making noise about that. Ann Coulter has abandoned Trump for the 17th time here now as on this issue because it keeps coming up and it keeps not happening. So we'll see. But it's definitely one that fired up the base. And if he doesn't get it done, I can see them perhaps blaming Congress more than him. But if it doesn't get done, it could hurt turnout. And let's be honest, the Democrats aren't going to have a turnout problem in 2020.
Vote for me because I'll do in my second term all the stuff I said I was going to get done in my first term. Is really not an inspiring rallying cry.
All right, Jim, let's move on to our final horrific martini for Thursday. Washington Examiner, Senators Jeff Flake of Arizona and Chris Coons of Delaware. Remember, they're the ones that got the brief delay in the Kavanaugh vote to expand the FBI investigation. On Wednesday, they introduced a carbon tax bill to combat climate change, just days before the end of the current session of Congress. The bill is similar to bipartisan legislation introduced in the House last month that would tax carbon emissions and return the proceeds to American households as a dividend. The House version was the first bipartisan carbon tax legislation introduced in nearly a decade. That bill has 8 co-sponsors, including Republican Representatives Francis Rooney of Florida, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Dave Trott of Michigan, along with Congressman Ted Deutsch of Florida, the Democratic co-chair of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. Something tells me there's a few more Democrats in that bipartisan caucus. Both the House and Senate bills would impose a tax of $15 per ton of carbon dioxide in 2019, increasing $10 each year and rising to nearly $100 per ton by 2030. The legislation then distributes all the proceeds from the tax as a flat monthly rebate to American households. So, Jim, this is a guy who used to defend taxpayers to the hilt, and now he's all for income redistribution. Jeff Flake can't leave soon enough.
Greg, I would agree with you about Flake. I'm just going to note when he leaves, I hope he leaves for Paris. I mean, my guess is he may walk around and say, my God, there's so much smoke in the air. We must do something about global warming. The whole air smelled like tear gas or something, and everyone was shouting and so upset. So, look, first of all, I can't think of anything more purely symbolic than introducing legislation about a month before you leave Congress. Actually, not even
a week.
10 days. In case you're wondering, once Congress has changed, right? This is the ending of this Congress. The new Congress takes office in January 3rd, I believe. Once you have that transition and changeover, the legislative clock, so to speak, everything gets reset to zero. And if you had legislation that had not passed in the previous Congress, you have to reintroduce it. Now, for a lot of bills, it's not. It's simply a matter of basically photocopying it, updating the dates, and resubmitting it, and everything with it. Now, what's really frustrating and complicating is if you've been through the subcommittee process, the committee process, maybe pass one chamber but not the other. That's when it's you go straight back, go directly to jail, do not collect $200. You're back to square one, and you have to go through this whole process again. Now, if it passed the previous Congress, maybe you feel pretty good about your chances here, but Jeff Flake's not even going to be around to do this in January. So it's just kind of like hey, here's something I wish I'd done. Didn't get to it, but there you go. And it's just going to be there, and it's going to die a quick death. And it really is now. We're like total kabuki theater, totally purely symbolic gesture, no actual impact on anything. I mean, it just kind of goes to show just how thorough the transformation of Jeff Flake is. Also, I noticed, do you think Democratic environmentalists, Greg, are just going to, Jeff Flake is awesome now. You do stuff like this, you alienate your base, and the other side, doesn't really give you much credit either. So, not sure what Jeff Flake is doing, but that's kind of been that's probably a good way to wrap up the year, huh, Greg? What is Jeff Flake doing? Kind of summarizes 2018 in a whole bunch of ways.
I'm totally going to date myself here. I don't know if you were a big fan of the Jeffersons as a kid growing up, when George Jefferson would be in a bad mood and somebody came to the door, and it was either somebody he didn't like, which was most of the cast, and or somebody who had bad news for him. He just whipped the door back in their face. And Jeff Flake coming around wanting to talk about anything starting in 2019 and beyond, that's pretty much going to be my attitude.
Yeah. Nope. Bad. Goodbye, Jeff. Take care. Happy trails. Go to Paris. go proselytize for this on the streets of Paris and see how well it goes.
Don't forget your vest.
Boy, they really take public safety at night very seriously over there. Everybody was wearing a safety vest out there.
Jim, what a horrific day of martinis, but we have good news because starting tomorrow, Friday, December 21st, the first of our 6-part installment of the 2018 Three Martini Lunch Awards. 3 different awards, 6 different days, taking us all the way up to New Year's Eve. Going to be very exciting. We've got the Person of the Year, Rising Stars, Fading Stars, underrated, overrated. We'll talk about the media, lots of different stuff in the next few episodes as we try to encapsulate a truly bizarre year of 2018.
Can't wait, Greg.
We'll have some happier thoughts, at least in some of those episodes. Jim, on that note, last regular show for 2018. We'll talk to you later.
See you both tomorrow and next year, Greg.
Yes. Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And do tune in starting tomorrow for those great year-end editions of the Three Martini Lunch.